Kant's concept of the categorical imperative is a remarkable achievement in moral philosophy. There is much to recommend Kant's discovery. Despite its explanation or explanatory power and intuitive appeal, however, there are many philosophical objections to the categorical imperative. Some criticisms are misguided and demonstrably unsound, while others are more pointed and difficult to answer. We're still reading Immanuel Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. But let's begin with an objection that reflects a basic misunderstanding of the categorical imperative. It is a necessary reminder, but one all too easily lost sight of in the discussion of Kant's moral philosophy. Many say that Kant does not propose to defend the categorical imperative by arguing that it would be desirable or undesirable if a certain maxim in question were to become universal. He does not suggest that the agent contemplating suicide or reneging or contemplating on a promise to repay a debt would be unhappy with the predictable result if everyone were adopt the practice. If that were Kant's point, his moral philosophy would reduce simply to a form of consequentialism. Kant does not offer another version of the golden rule or the Confucian edict to do unto others as you would have others do unto you. The question of what the agent would or would not like to have others do to him cannot possibly be relevant to Kant's formalist ethics. That would be a matter of empirical psychology involving desire or inclination and the expectation of consequences to accrue to certain actions in this world or another to come. The categorical imperative boils down instead to a question of what it is or is not formally contradictory in attempt to universalize a moral maxim or what a rational moral agent logically can or cannot will. Much as the ancient Stoa taught that morality is entirely independent of contingent circumstances, so that the wise man can be happy in his virtue even on the rack. So Kant holds that an agent from the viewpoint of ethical evaluation is enslaved by considerations of what may promote or frustrate happiness. The determination of individual or collective happiness is the source at most of an external basis for moral action that is not grounded on reason alone. Kant believes that reason must break free of empirical contingencies by accepting its own law or practical reasoning in the categorical imperative. Kant more completely analyzes the essential features of moral maxims to be universalized in correct applications of the categorical imperative, and he distinguishes between three ways of thinking about the categorical imperative when he explains, and it's now in color green in front of you, and we will look at it more closely. The above three ways of representing the principle of morality are at bottom only so many formulae of the very same law, and any one of them of itself unites the other two in it. There is nevertheless a difference among them, which is indeed subjectively rather than objectively practical, intended namely to bring an idea of reason close to intuition by a certain analogy and thereby to feeling. All maxims have, namely, a form, which consists in universality, and in this respect, the formula of the moral imperative is expressed thus that moral maxims must be chosen as if they were to hold as universal laws of nature to matter, namely an end. In this respect, the formula says that rational beings as an end by its nature, and hence as the end in itself, must in every maxim serve as the limiting condition of all merely relative and arbitrary ends. And lastly, a complete determination of all maxims by means of that formula, namely that all maxims from one's own law giving are to harmonize with the possible kingdom of ends as with the kingdom of nature. A progression takes place here, as though the categories of the unity of the form of the will, its universality, the plurality of the matter of objects, that is, of ends, and the allness or totality of the system of these. But one does better always to proceed in moral appraisal with a strict method and put at its basis the universal formula of the categorical imperative. Act in accordance with a maxim that can at the same time make itself a universal law. If, however, one wants also to provide access for the moral law, it is very useful to bring one and the same action under the three concepts mentioned above, and thereby, as far as possible, bring it closer to intuition. There are formal, material, and legislative styles of characterizing the categorical imperative. We can think of the categorical imperative as formal when we emphasize the logical compatibility or incompatibility of the rational will, willing a given moral maxim to be a universal law for all rational beings. We can also do so in terms of its material aspects in obligating moral agents to treat all rational beings as ends in themselves and never merely as means to another end. We can finally do so also legislatively from the standpoint of the requirements of an ideal kingdom of ends, which we consider further below. The question whether the promise maker's prior intent not to repay a debt violates the categorical imperative to reconsider Kant's second example cannot be determined on the basis of whether the promise maker would be happy or unhappy with the results if everyone acted in accord with the same maxim. The problem is to be decided on rational grounds, on logic alone. The mechanism is the procedure of examining the will for contradictions. Can the dishonest promise maker with logical consistency simultaneously will not to repay the debt and also will that all rational beings act in accord with the same maxim? No, says Kant. For then the intuition of promising itself would collapse, and gestures to promise the repayment of debt would be met only by ridicule. It is therefore strictly inconsistent to will both things at once, to obtain a law fraudulently and to will that everyone do so. The categorical imperative implies that the bad faith will to promise and that everyone adopts the same principles are logically inconsistent in their ultimate consequences. Reason proves to reason by the categorical imperative that it is morally wrong to make false promises. And when reason accepts reason's judgments, it acquiesces to an autonomous law, thereby securing the very foundations or ultimately presuppositions of free and morally responsible action. There is nevertheless a potential counterexample to Kant's principle of the categorical imperative. We are supposed to ask whether a moral maxim justifying a contemplated action can be willed to be a universal moral law for all rational beings, and we are supposed to judge whether or not a contemplated action can be rationally willed to be a universal law for all rational beings by determining whether or not the attempt rationally to will the universality of the maxim is formally consistent or entails some type of logical contradiction. The categorical imperative itself is, needless to say, categorical. What, however, if the moral maxims to be considered for consistent universalizability by rational will are themselves conditional? Here it appears Kant's principles is vulnerable to criticism. Suppose that a moral maxim entertained by the rational will has this form, making specific reference to the unique situation in which the moral agent in question happens to be Immanuel Kant, and has the form, if you are Immanuel Kant, then commit as many crimes against humanity as you desire. There appears to be no contradiction whatsoever, at least in Immanuel Kant's rationally willing that the conditional maxim personalized to his particular case be universally adopted by all rational beings, since the maxim does not authorize wrongdoing by anyone other than himself. The trouble is that as Kant defines the categorical imperative, only the imperative itself is explicitly required to be unconditional. He leaves unsaid what particular type of logical structure, if any, the maxims to which the imperative refers may or must have. And this leaves the thesis open to a host of similar objections. To close the gap, Kant takes Kant's theory in a direction he might not have approved. Despite these cautions, there is good reason to think that the solution is available that is largely in keeping with Kant's statement on the categorical imperative. Since the categorical imperative itself is unconditional, it may seem natural to extend the same logical form to the maxims of moral conduct to which it refers. It cannot be argued that if the maxims mentioned in the categorical imperative are not also unconditional, then the categorical imperative itself cannot be unconditional, since the mere reference to another class of proposition by a proposition does not imply that the two share the same logical status. This makes it necessary, if the solution is regarded as the most promising method of preserving Kant's doctrine against this kind of criticism, to add the assumption that not only is the categorical imperative unconditional, but the moral maxims referred to in the universalizability requirement of the categorical imperative must also be universal or unconditional. The most persuasive internal evidence in favor of the proposal is that it not only solves objections involving conditional personalized moral maxims, but preserves Kant's characteristic central claim that nothing empirically contingent or conditional must be allowed to taint the rationalist foundations of ethics. If the moral maxims referred to in the categorical imperative are not themselves unconditional, then Kant's ethical system as a whole is not purely rationalist, but is compromised at its very foundations in the law of reason by such incontingencies of empirical circumstance as whether or not the agent contemplating the principle happens in this case to be Immanuel Kant. This suggests, but certainly does not prove, that Kant may have intended all along for the moral maxim referred to in the categorical imperative to be absolutely conditional, unconditional. The final test of the solution is whether unconditional moral maxims are adequate to capture ethical conclusions otherwise thought to be entailed by the categorical imperative. The place to begin may be with Kant's four applications, to see how his illustrations work when limited exclusively to unconditional maxims. Even without re-examining these deductions, it is possible to suggest in a general way how unconditional moral maxims, together with another of Kant's principles that ought implies can, may do justice to the most problematic intuitions about morally correct action in a deontological ethics. It is sometimes said that Kant's moral system cannot satisfactorily explain obligations related to contingent abilities like medical expertise, typically expressed by conditional principles such as if you are an able physician, then whenever someone is injured, you ought to respond by giving appropriate assistance. Certainly, qualified physicians alone should apply their training in such circumstances, while those without the requisite knowledge who are likely to do more harm than good if they try to help ought not directly to intervene. Can the moral content of these apparently conditional obligation be maintained by an unconditional maxim? The principle might be preserved by invoking the unconditional maxim to preserve and protect human lives as intrinsically valuable ends in themselves, supplemented by Kant's principle that ought implies can, this time reading can not as logical possibility but manifest physical ability. This principle itself remains unconditional, but is imposed in applications under particular circumstances on all and only those who have the ability to act in its accord. If I am a qualified physician, then, other things being equal, I am morally obligated to help an accident victim. If I lack the necessary training for a medical procedure, if in that sense I cannot do what is needed, then I am in no direct obligation to become involved beyond calling for others for help. Think about what we have spoken. Again, thank you for listening. This is Samo't sa Simula. I hope you share, like, and subscribe to this channel. Maraming salamat.